this nice introduction and indeed making this connection to Crimean Peninsula, which is so clearly, is so clearly in our minds together with what's happening in Ukraine as a whole. And what do I want to do here today? I was just trying to think what would be the most useful in this context here. So maybe my focus is more like what would be methodologically useful, how to think in different ways about Russian colonialism. And when I chose my focus, I particularly also thought like, okay, what would work in Ukrainian context? Because you can frame these stories in very different ways. So yes, it will be kind of moving from one thing to another, but I'm starting maybe in a familiar place for you. Yuri Andrukhovich and Martin promised to read the quote in Ukrainian in the best possible pronunciation, so I will not
The both pieces, yeah?
Let's just do like,
okay.
Yeah, this one.
Але в тому нещасті імперії, що вона вирішила поєднати непоєднуване естонців з туркменами, а де на її мапі ми, українці, десь посередині. А я пересуваюся додому. Існує така країна, вона до болю справжня і нічим не захищена від Сходу, навіть горами. Якби хтось свого часу, хто роздає географію, порадився зі мною, то нині все виглядало б інакше. Але він розмістив нашу країну саме так, де йому схотілося. Дякую йому за це.
Thank you. So let me just ask you out of curiosity, how many of you have read this novel? Okay, a couple, actually a good amount, yes. And you probably already understood why I chose it. It actually put Estonia already in the map for Ukrainians. And in some ways, my interests are quite similar to what Moscoviada is doing, and it's a striking document of its era, right? Written in 1992, I think maybe one of the first, maybe the very first post-colonial novel that would look back into the collapse of the Soviet Empire. If anyone knows one which is written even before that, I'd be curious to see, because it's really written right after the collapse of the empire. And many things that are interesting for me in this novel and in this particular quote, you already see it. First of all, indeed, this placing and thinking about different cultures and nationalities which were part of that Soviet empire. Also interesting that for Moscoviat, Turkmens and Estonians you can kind of place, and then Ukrainians is a question mark. Where exactly are they? I thought this is an interesting dynamic. So, and the novel is really trying to think through what does it mean to be Ukrainian in that particular era. And I also like very much also this, and I mean obviously it's very telling that we are reading these words right now. Actually, when I was doing my slides yesterday and writing down these lines, and it is not protected from the east in any way. In my hotel room there was a funeral procession passing by. It's like so much exactly what we hear here, and it was really striking for me how you have these echoes of what used to be and what is continuing on still. And at the same time, this question of this is where we are, this particular location, and those of you who don't read Ukrainian, our Estonian friends, I would also add that this, I didn't translate this final part. It's basically, okay, if this one who, set up geography would have asked me, I would have chosen a different location. However, I was not asked, and thank you that we have a place at all, right? And what's striking for me is that this was a topos which was also common among Estonians, that very same period, late 1980s, the crumbling of the empire. We had one very popular singer who had the song about how Estonia is grabbing also Ireland and we are sailing away to find a better place. So this sense of we are stuck in a certain place, which we love, but at the same time it has some very unfortunate consequences. So, and Vitaly Chernesky has called this novel as anti-imperialist counter-narrative. This is another phrase which characterizes very well something that I want to do and I aim to do in my research. Looking comparatively, then Estonians, Turkmens, I cannot really work much, but a little bit I'm trying to do these connections and also generate anti-imperialist counter-narratives. In our present situation, where basically what I feel like we mostly need is solidarities and dialogues, so that we can move towards more inhabitable future. And the best way how to do it is through cross-cultural dialogues and comparisons. And while we are doing these comparisons, Estonians, Turkmen, Ukrainians, we obviously shouldn't try to homogenize, but make sure we understand also the differences. Each situation there necessarily creates cultural logic of its own, dependent on our histories, locations, geopolitics that surround us. And so in the situation where we find ourselves these days, we do have these imperial positions, still glorification of Russian Empire, and these imperial ideologies that tend to be sticky, and they create epistemic silences, and what I try to do and what I call also others to do is to counter these in our scholarship. And I think comparative work is especially good for that. So in order to resist Russia's imperial epistemologies, which is still present, we need to just understand and in our scholarship spread this word that Russia's present wave of aggression is not a set of isolated conflicts, but rather we see a continuation of history's long process of imperial violence. And we need to reach this full acknowledgement of Russia's historical, imperial and colonial violence across Russia's imperial destruction zone, where we both belong. And then my own particular interest here, which again, if you look at this image, this first one, you very much understand that it is very, an approach which is quite urgent these days. An ecosocial approach, I call an approach that includes an interest in ideologies and political regimes, but also moves beyond them to draw attention to the very concrete material and environmental impact of political rule. And I think this present Russia's war brings it out very, very clearly, but in some other times we tend to forget how thoroughly our environments and our human lives are actually intertwined. We cannot do without the environments, and what I've been trying to do is, we are talking about environmental humanities. I don't like this term because I think environmental thinking should be part of any field in humanities. So no separate environmental humanities, but just let's think about environments, whatever we do. And so this is a book of mine that came out last year. And this image I also have in my book, the boulder. And this is very much part of Estonian cultural landscape. You can call it Estonian ecosocial landscape in that particular image. And this image is before Soviet annexation in Estonia. So 1929, Estonia was an independent republic, and you have a lot of these boulders. So this is, we can call it a gift from Scandinavia because they arrived when the ice receded at the end of the ice age. And these are important part of our cultural understanding, especially for those of Estonians who have grown up by the sea. So I've climbed so many of these as a child. And we get back to this boulder at the very end of my talk, unless I seriously run out of time, which might happen. Okay, and then I also, what's important for me, and you already saw it in my title, this embodied lives. So as scholars, we live obviously embodied lives. We are situated inside our bodies, and thus it's important for me always also locate myself as a scholar. And I don't want to say that, ooh, I'm an Estonian, but I want to say, I usually try to say, well, I'm a sea person. So, and this is just very recent image of my sea. So you can kind of situate this talk as coming from that sea. And to still situate it a little bit more, just a reminder, right? We of course all know the maps, but it's never something that you can very well remind yourself while looking at it, is that this tiny thing here is Estonia, right? Then you have Latvia and Lithuania, also relatively big, and Ukraine is a great big country, of course, if you look at here. For us, Ukraine is like, wow, so many millions of people, it's amazing. For Estonia, if Russia, attacks, it's like 10 minutes and you don't have a country anymore. Well, this is exaggeration, of course. And and notice also all this sea, right? And the Scandinavian countries, which have always been part of our imagination, even if sometimes quite during the Soviet era very difficult to access. And to go more zoom in, then my first short fragment of a story which I want to share with you comes from about here. So you see sea, a lot of sea and islands. And let me then share with you a short story, because I'm also a writer. I have published a couple of novels, and this is something that I also included in my Soviet postcolonial studies book, to situate, to understand the role of the sea, the land, and the imperial rule. Introduction for us here. One summer day in the late 1970s, as I was walking on the beach with my cousin, not far from the city of Tallinn in the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic in the USSR. We had met by accident at the best swimming place in the area, the one that you saw in the very first image only, in the summer obviously there was no ice. Her summer home was about 2 or 3 kilometers away. Since the seashore was rocky there, her family often rode their bikes to this sandy beach. She wanted to show me their shoreline and proposed that we could walk together by the beach until we reached their part of the coast. So we headed off together, 2 barefoot girls, now jumping rock to rock, now walking in the water, now heading to the shore. Soon we were hailed by loud shouts in Russian. A figure in military uniform stepped from the forest and demanded to know why we were there. We tried to explain in our rudimentary Russian that we were walking by the sea, and pointing ahead, explained that she, my cousin, lived in this direction. We were ordered gruffly to return the way we came. Walking there was not allowed. Frightened, confused, and disappointed, we turned back. So, and then there are some questions, and I still feel this confusion in my body decades and decades later. How could this person have the right to step between us and our sea, our rocks, our sand, and our games? Why did we have to defend our desire to walk by the sea? And the answers here is this is one very preliminary thinking about how to understand Soviet colonial rule in that particular context. we felt it very much that someone imposes certain sets of rules outside for us. We have no way to deal with them. This someone is clearly different from us, speaks a language which I think I was about a second grader or something. I knew a little tiny bit of Russian, but not very much. My friend was a bit older, but anyway, we were feeling uncomfortable in that. And then what then basically happened in this cultural situation, we were prescribed the boundaries of our playground, and thus shaped the topography of our possibilities. So no one beat us, or no one said that you cannot play or anything. We had plenty of freedom, we could just return and play, but not beyond that particular area, and we could not step any further. So, and I think this is for me a very kind of a good logical way to start thinking about Soviet colonial rule. Obviously, I understand for Ukrainians it's different. Some things would not work exactly quite like that, but as I argue about these differences. Okay, let's move on and just go through some basic terms so we understand what we are talking about. So imperialism, colonialism, people are often confused, and it's just they are defined in different ways. Sometimes I have one good friend who says that these are different spheres completely. I would say they are overlapping terms. For me, imperialism is a wider term. So very often when you talk about colonial something, you could actually say imperial something, and that's fine. So they both are used to describe a politics of subordination, in which one nation or imperial entity imposes upon another in a different geographical location. Imperialism does not necessarily involve large population transfers and asserting claims over territory. I think for me this is a substantial and important point. So we are talking about settler colonialism, people settling in there. Imperialism doesn't have to. We can talk right now about American imperialism. It does not imply settling any people in different territories. And again, imperialism asserts very clearly claims over territory. We set up the rules in this shore now. And colonialism involves a multidimensional domination of a concrete territory and often a significant influx of new settlers. And then some clear overlaps. Both imperialism and colonialism is motivated by extractivist ambitions and by geopolitical considerations. I mean, now whatever you hear from the US is all like, where can you extract something, right? And this is, it could be both imperialism and colonialism. And they pursue free or cheap labor and raw materials. And are driven by the belief in the greatness and superiority of their own culture, worldview, and socio-political arrangements. And just to focus more concretely on colonialism, and I occasionally have this small image of that book of mine, then usually this material comes from there. Colonialism can be defined as a political, economic, and cultural system of domination over a nation or a region by a culturally, ethnically, and linguistically different nation or imperial entity. And it's not a fixed phenomenon, right? Every post-coloniality is always different, is situated, and also every coloniality. There's no one proper model. It's a historically evolving phenomenon. And then right now, these days, there's a lot of talk about interimperiality. So it's a popular term. And Laura Doyle's book, Interimperiality from 2020, was, I think, actually Doyle had some early short pieces already, but this was definitely the one that established this term. And Laura Doyle wants to point out and stress that different empires of different kinds, sizes, and means form in dialectical relation. So one empire always, I think really always, talks to another empire. And here, this is material from my forthcoming piece of mine, which was supposed to be out already last year, and I'm still waiting every day. But anyways, it's not out yet. So I'm starting with this quote by Donald Trump. You know, they may make a deal, they may not make a deal, they may be Russia someday, they may not be Russia someday. And I told them that I want the equivalent of $500 billion worth of rare earth, and they've essentially agreed to that. That was February, so more than a year ago. We know that the story became a little bit, less horrible as it evolved, but that was such a shock, right? To remember, if you still remember these times, the beginning of the Trump's presidency. And this image here, if you see the date, it is the February 26, 2022. And you know how many, is it like 4th day of the war? Izvestia. I tried to follow later, I think it was not so easy, but so Izvestia main page, right? Most important, or one of the 2-3 most important Russian outlets, it has this image of Trump and Putin shaking hands, and the text here is Trump naзвал Putina умным президентом. So, and this indeed was a phrase that Trump used. It was covered in the US press and then picked up by Russian press. The image, the handshake, is from an earlier time. It wasn't exactly that Trump, flew over to Russia to shake hands with Putin when the war started, when Putin started the war, full-scale war. But so I think what we are talking here is indeed this inter-imperiality is a pretty good word, but just to be more precise, it made me think about, I guess I also wanted to share this slide, that inter-imperiality might be a relatively new term, but the conversation about how imperial and colonial projects are competitive, comparative, this is an old discussion. And you have actually quite a good research done about Russian Empire as echoing and imitating other empires. So Russian officials in the 19th century referred to the Amur River as Russian Mississippi, Caucasus as our Algeria, and so they wanted to be like other empires. But to get back to imperiality and our present era, so for me it seemed like thinking about how Trump, only talks about rare earths in Ukraine and shaking hands with Putin, then maybe inter-imperial invisibility would be a good way to think about it through this term. Firstly, you have imperial blindness, right? They just do not see. And then the interaction between different empires creates certain kind of invisibility from their perspective. So and this is from a forthcoming piece, which perhaps is already available, open access tomorrow, but not yet today. So I say that inter-imperial invisibility is a condition created by the interaction of imperial entities that threatens to discard, annihilate, or minimize the agency of non-imperial states, lands, and cultures, overriding them into targets of opportunity for imperial control, domination, and enrichments. But we don't have to really go through all of it, because I really just wanted as just a little addition. And so what is one of how it works? It's a form of systemic violence. It grants no respect for states and the nation's right to self-determination and dignity, the right to exist as, to borrow Darya Tsimbalyuk's words from this book of Darya's, as a place which is loved, as a home for humans and other species, not only humans. So inter-imperial invisibility does not necessarily rob its target country of agency, even though historically it has often happened so, but it can also provoke not only powerful internal protest, but also perhaps hopefully powerful international support. So I'm just throwing this term in here, but if you want to know more or how do I elaborate on this, then hopefully this article will be available, and it will be available open access then very soon. But to go back to earlier times, to Soviet period, then seems to me there are many ways how you can enter into these discussions. You can talk about economy, for example. You can talk about very basic ideological structures. But I thought maybe one good way, which would work also well in Ukrainian context, would be look at these four core, roads, so to say, to this topic: land, question of language, question of body, and then question of history and memory. So, and the question here would be how to talk about the local ecosocial impact of Soviet colonial rule. And just to introduce, and here I'm thinking land and body intertwined, because all these four basic road maps to this topic are of course fully intertwined. Let's read a small vision by Sofia Imiarova from Kazakh perspective. This is a collection where it's a photo, and this photo starts or invites a recollection of that context when the photo was taken. The photographs were one of the little joys in the existence of rural children and adolescents who spent most of their lives in the collective farm fields. Officially, children began their labor activity in the fields from 5th grade, when the students of our school were annually released from classes for 2 months from the end of September until almost December to help with the harvest. Informally, students also worked with their parents in the fields from May to November. I remember that when we returned to school in September, the Russian teacher gave us an assignment to write on the topic how I spent my summer vacations, and most of the class handed him a blank sheet of paper. The teacher never gave us a failing grade. He understood everything and, as it seemed to me, silently empathized with us. The practice of the unwritten essay continued year after year with different teachers and in different grades. Apparently, this topic was mandatory in school curriculum, even though there was no summer holidays to speak of in our stern collective farm childhood, when we got up at sunrise and worked until sunset. Almost every day from 7 or 8 in the morning, my brothers and sisters and I walked several kilometers with 5-liter thermos flasks and heavy bags of food in our hands for 6 months a year, apart from Saturdays and Sundays. So, and for me it's just a fragment, but I'm happy to say that Sofia Imiarova will come to Estonia this spring and early summer, and we will hopefully work together on some collective piece of writing where we can have more of that comparisons. So the questions here is it's really an exhausted body, right? It's a child's body which is overexploited. Instead of holidays, there's just no holidays, blank sheets of paper. At the same time, it's also part of that story of basically overexploitation of land, cotton fields, monoculture. We know that it had huge economic consequences, and part of that story is also the shrinking of the Aral Sea. It's a story of famines, because these people were forced to cultivate cotton so that the Soviet government would have a hard currency, instead of actually cultivating some crops that would feed them. So you have huge millions dying and famine, as you know, in a similar way as Holodomor in Ukraine. And environmental consequences which will never be overcome, right? Okay, so this was, we will return to questions of language, body and land, but also a little bit about language here as one of these road maps to thinking about coloniality. And I think this is most familiar topic for Ukrainian context, right? So, and it's a very, very, well researched colonial topic. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a Kenyan author, is one of those who have written a lot about it. The ballad was the means of the physical subjugation, language was the means of the spiritual subjugation. And you have so many different, aspects how that worked. Imposition of the colonial language in school, use of colonial language in administration, ban of printing books and periodicals in a local language. And so, as a result, the colonized cultures they don't have any other way. They need to take over the language of the colonizer. And we have the whole, world history is full of these cases. Quite famous one is Martinique poet Aimé Césaire, well-known, author, because he started writing in French. And then Kyrgyz writer Chingiz Aitmatov, and I returned to Aitmatov some more, published his major work in Russian. And then later in the decolonial era, there's of course efforts to return to the pre-colonial language and for example, Ngugi wa Thiong'o started writing in Kikuyu in his later life. And here, in the context of the Soviet Union, we have continuity, right? These strategies were established, or at least set up already during the ways before Soviet years, during the Russian Empire. These Tsarist era colonial persecutions, which you all here know very well, this long history of different bans and language use, persecution of non-Russian cultural figures. But then from the perspective of Estonians and Latvians, we actually, more or less, to a big extent, we escaped this because there was a bit of, special conditions. The cultural context, we could talk about double-layered colonialism in the 19th century and earlier, Baltic German landlords. So German was the main cultural context, and the language, which was, so to say, this primary colonizer's language. And the Russification started only in the 1880s, and this was too late actually to seriously impact nation-building processes. So there was already strong enough vernacular movement towards national cultures. So yeah, this complete takeover of language did not happen in Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania is a bit of a different case, but we can talk if we have time or if you are interested. But yeah, so again, this is a common story, that the colonizer's language then becomes to signify a high culture, and what is especially damaging is the natural or objective status attributed to such value judgment. Of course, Russian is a great culture, right? It's obviously so much greater than any other culture which was part of the Russia's sphere of imperial aggression. And this story is just to stress that it's useful for us to look at it in the larger context of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and many other cultures in comparison. And then to go to body, and actually I want to also talk about land more in detail, so try to be quick here, but body is such an endless topic again, right? And you can talk in so many different ways how, and here Homi Bhabha's quote is maybe a good starting point. The body is always simultaneously inscribed in both the economy of pleasure and desire and the economy of discourse, domination and power. And you can see there's endless ways you can think about the colonized body, the interplays of pleasure, desire, power, domination. In some ways, all these post-colonial approaches or colonial critiques are critiqued as being binary. I think in some ways they are binary. If we talk about land, we can see there's clearly binary aspect to it. Body, in terms of body, it is not a binary thing, right? It's just like how your body becomes ingrained by some impacts, how it is reflecting one way and another. We are talking about traumatized, colonized body. Nora Extena's novel Mates Piens is a very mother, and it's actually translated into English as Soviet milk. The original title is Mother's Milk. So this novel is one example, for example, of how the body becomes fully traumatized. And one thing which is actually kind of remarkable about Extena's novel is that they were settled already starting from 1920s and without any claims that they are bourgeois nationalists or anything, but just because seemed like it was good for cotton production. So, and to move past, and just to give, again a comparison to North America, the Trail of Tears and the resettling of Native Americans, many Soviet mass population transfers, and then also this ecosocial violence. You can talk about it in terms of all union industries which locals had no control over. And this one here is Sillamäe radioactive tailings pond in Estonia, which is set up directly by the sea. So I think no one who cares about the land or the water, even a little tiny bit, would ever do such a thing, right? But this was, and again, Estonians had no control. Sillamäe was closed city; you couldn't even access it. And this is, how this was handled by all Soviet industry, Uranian production. And so when you could visit military sites after the collapse of the Soviet Union rule, you could just pump water in Estonian military sites, and you just only get sludge. So you had all these images of just people lighting fires and whatever they pump out from their wells. And these numbers are kind of striking. It was not an openly available publication, but 1977 there was an analysis that about 50% of Estonia's groundwater sources would be polluted by the year 2000. Well, happily, the empire did not last as long as that. And so I already mentioned the fact that you could not just go walk by the sea wherever you wanted. So let's not just talk about it. You could go on designated places, but you could not often enough walk any further. And and you had to have a special permit in order to visit Estonian islands. So this is my family going to visit, the only time in my childhood when we could got a permit and go and visit, and that was pretty amazing. This is me here. So, and what I want to finish and wrap up here is this, that for me, how I also want to think about it is that you end up with something like mismatch between land belonging together with land and colonial style politics. And here this colonial ecosocial violence it's not something like, wow, I'm now facing some physical abuse or whatever, but it restricts the use of everyday interaction with homely environments. And I just want to finish with these 3 images of cows because of my environmental interests. This is Olga Terry's painting from 1979 or 1980 to link it to the beginning of this talk. My walk at the beginning was about the same era, and it's kind of a striking cow. So Estonian art historians like to think about this cow, like why, this is an era of colhouses, right? Cows should be thought only like together with 1,000 other cows or 100 or whatever. And this cow is like in an existential vacuum almost. It's a philosopher cow thinking about the sadness of its existence. And this cow for me talks to a particular cow in Wilson, the island, where we know I had seen a story how a cow died on a tiny island in recently because veterinarian was delayed because of official restrictions upon movement in the border zone. So, remote from political struggle, a cow dies on a rocky windswept island because of an absurdly strict border regime in the Baltic borderlands of the USSR. A powerful image of excessive colonial violence, leaving victims both human and non-human. And this cow has now gotten more friends, so let me finish with, hey, where's my note? Okay, I need to put this particular cow. So, but this cow got saved. This is actually kind of a happier story, even some way, story of heroism and story of how people can help and they can evacuate at least some of these suffering animals. And this is thanks to Daria Cymbaluk, whose book also included reference to this video. So thank you, this is all for me. Thank you for listening.